welcome all to the fourth session of the class struggle. And this has been a wonderful, very productive lecture series and for the fall. And I think that this will be our last fall session. And I'm just going to announce a change of our plan for today. Unfortunately, just this morning, we've heard that Professor Nick Estes will not be able to join us because he participated in the last few days or weeks as part of the international delegation observant of the Venezuela parliamentary election, and he is stranded in Venezuela, so he couldn't arrive back home, on time to participate in our session. However, we decided that we're not going to cancel the session or wait for rescheduling it, because we have a amazing sort of a presenter, Dr. Chandni Desai, that and then therefore decided to continue the conversation, and I'm sure that it will be a wonderful exchange of ideas and conversation, not only maybe even focusing for today, but if we have time, we can also have a little bit of a reflection of the series that we have had for this term. So welcome, and I'm very much looking forward to Chandni's presentation. And I'm going to pass on the floor to Shirin Haghgou, one of the doctoral students, facilitator, and the moderator, and then also the person behind organizing all the series with Genevieve Ricci and Wissal Abu Ghaddam, which they really made this session to be a great success. So Shirin, I'm going to invite you to take on your role as the facilitator of this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Shahzad. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And thank you, Chandni, for being so gracious in accepting all of these last-minute changes, very much in line with how 2020 has been, all about adapting last minute. So the Class Struggle Working Group is part of the Working Group Initiative at the Jackman Humanities Institute at the University of Toronto. And although we're all meeting from different places through Zoom today, the University of Toronto is on land that for thousands of years has been on the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And it remains the home to Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. In the context of today's session on Indigenous resistance and global solidarity, this land acknowledgement is not only a reminder of the ongoing dispossession and expropriation of Indigenous lands, but as well a reminder of thousands of years of Indigenous resistance and struggle for self-determination. And both of the authors speak to the tradition of Indigenous resistance and struggle in the readings for today, and as well that relationship to other anti-colonial and anti-imperial struggles, which we have also already discussed in previous sessions. In that context, it's worth mentioning that in this moment, not too far from Toronto in Caledonia, there's an ongoing blockade by members of the Six Nations Grand River protesting the construction of a housing project on unceded land. And of course, this is against the backdrop of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as it calls to action, and its calls to action regarding reconciliation between Canadians and Indigenous peoples, which many now claim to be dead. And most recently, on December 3rd, the Canadian government announced that they will be implementing new legislation to initiate the process of aligning Canadian law with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was introduced in 2007. And and the process of this declaration was outlined in detail in Our History is the Future. And it was mentioned that this UN declaration came to be as a result of Indigenous internationalism's work in taking the conversation of Indigenous self-determination outside of the framework of individual nation states. And I thought that Nick Estes contextualizes the tradition of Indigenous resistance really well and helps us to further think through what an acknowledgement of land really means. On page 248, he writes, ancestors of Indigenous resistance didn't merely fight against settler colonialism, they fought for Indigenous life and just relations with human and non-human relatives and with the earth. Indigenous resistance is not a one-time event. It continually asks, what proliferates in the absence of empire? Thus, it defines freedom not as the absence of settler colonialism, but as the amplified presence of Indigenous life and just relations with human and non-human relatives and with the earth. And central to both of the pieces today is a dialectical and a relational analysis. And this approach in both of these texts allows us to better identify what it is that we're in struggle for, which that excerpt from Nick Estes also talks about. In last session's readings, Robin Kelly's Freedom Dreams, Kelly points that often it seems that it's clear what we're fighting against, but not clear what it is that we're fighting for. And I argue that a dialectical approach allows us to understand better both what we're fighting against and what we're fighting for. For example, on page 232 in Nick Estes' book, he mentions that Indigenous nationhood is often misunderstood as an exclusive project, the sole aspiration of just Indigenous peoples, or as confined with the narrow definitions of the nation state. This is similar to the Indian problem. According to the International Indian Treaty Council that first met at the Standing Rock Indian Reservation in 1974, the problem was not Indigenous peoples. The problem was, and always has been, imperialism. And so this idea of knowing what it is that we're fighting for and what it is that we're fighting against is central to questions that Chandni and Nick ask in their respective pieces, the idea of what a particular kind of future could look like. And I'm just briefly going to go back to our first session in which Shahzad mentioned that we need an expansive analysis, and she used the word unravel, and that it can unravel what we're currently experiencing and observing. And going back to the reading from that first week, the authors quote Christina Heatherton in her review of David Rediger's book, Class, Race, and Marxism. And in that review, she, I think, very beautifully puts that the struggle is not only against capitalism, but that as well we need to, and I quote, exceed the limitations of its epistemology. And I identify the questions that Chandni and Nick Estes ask as ones that do encourage us to exceed these epistemological limitations of capitalism, and they offer openings for us to do so through their texts. Both authors ask us to think about a future not defined by relations of capital. Chandni asks us to, and I quote, imagine a future in life beyond colonialism and capitalism through struggle. So, with this conceptualization of the world and the future, both of the texts for this session open with a contemporary moment. Chandni takes us to the blockades in Unistoten and Wet'suwet'en in Canada in 2020, and Estes takes us to Standing Rock Indian Reservation at the heart of the resistance against the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2016, which he refers to as the most recent iteration of an Indian war that never ends on page 10. Both of the readings for this session historicize for us settler colonialism here on Turtle Island and in Palestine. But more than that, they connect the histories of these two disparate geographies and not only locate, but as well connect the struggles of Indigenous people of Turtle Island for sovereignty to that of the struggle of the Palestinian people against the illegal occupation of their lands. Both authors also ask us to think through these historical and contemporary moments, not as isolated events, but rather in relation to capitalist imperialism, and as such connected to the struggles of people for self-determination and freedom around the world. Equally as important, the authors demonstrate how this history is incomplete without the history of resistance, struggle, and solidarity by the very people who, through the logic of settler colonialism, should no longer exist. In this process, the authors challenge us to contend with complicated questions regarding the relationship between settler colonialism and primitive accumulation, logics of elimination and proletarianization, and ask us to consider how we approach these histories. By centering resistance, both authors are demonstrating the ways in which resistance to settler colonialism has changed and evolved over time to meet the changing mechanisms of dispossession, expropriation, extraction, and criminalization of Indigenous peoples and lands. And so this was just a way to sort of begin to put the two texts that we read for this session in conversation with each other. And so now I'm going to introduce Dr. Chandni Desai, and then we can move into the next part of the presentation. Dr. Chandni Desai is an assistant professor in the critical studies of equity and solidarity at the University of Toronto. She is working on her first book, Revolutionary Circuits of Liberation, the Radical Tradition of Palestinian Resistance, Culture, and Internationalism, and is working on a project tracing Afro-Asian literary cultures and political imaginaries and their transnational flows across the global South. She has written articles on Palestinian resistance culture, settler colonial economies, and resurgent solidarities, Palestinian oral history, archival violence and memoricide, carceral violence and technologies, memorializing state violence, decolonization, and solidarity. She is also the host of the Liberation Pedagogy Podcast, and so far, some of the episodes of the podcast have also featured some of the speakers for this working group, so I do encourage you to take a listen. And so Chandni, as Shaz had mentioned as well, we thought that we would go about today by you starting off by sort of walking us through your piece, which has some really complex analytical approaches that would be really great to discuss further. And then afterwards, I have some questions in mind, and we can also open the floor to participants. And we would really like for this to be more of a discussion and not treated necessarily as just a back and forth of questions and answers. And so in addition to start us off, Chandni, in addition to some of the points that I just briefly went over regarding your piece in the book, Our History is a Future, a central part of your piece is the critique you have of particular forms of analysis regarding the relationship between settler colonialism, capitalist social relations, and imperialism. And so if you could just walk us through some of those points to start off with.
Thank you. Thank you, Shirin, for that wonderful introduction. And just give me 1 second. I'm getting set up here. I am just playing with my screen. Just a minute. Oh boy, hang on. Okay. So I think I'm good here. Okay. So to begin, I just would like to thank all the organizers that Sharzad has mentioned, Sharzad, Wissal, Shirin, and Genevieve for the invitation, and also choosing this forthcoming article in the Journal of Palestine Studies for discussion. I, of course, was really looking forward to also being in conversation with Dr. Nick Estes, as his work in many ways speaks to my work, specifically this article, and I think my article also speaks to some of the themes and interventions that he's also bringing forward in our history. The title, I forget, but in his book. So, you know, I think as Shirin mentioned, earlier this year, we saw the Wet'suwet'en struggle really take a particular form of force in Canada in a way that we hadn't seen the year before. And the Wet'suwet'en struggle has been ongoing for a long time, but we saw a very different kind of force in the country, and we saw a different form of mobilization. And as that was happening, the Trump administration also passed or were releasing what is called the Deal of the Century, or the Trump Plan. And as these sorts of moments came together in 2020, there was also a resurgence of Indigenous Palestine solidarity that recatalyzed during sort of the height of the Wet'suwet'en land struggle against the construction of pipelines in Canada, as at the same time the Trump plan was being protested globally around the imperial and colonial material impact of what that was going to look like in Palestine. And that really started to make me think about, putting this article together and writing this article as I received an invitation from the Journal of Palestine Studies to think this through and write about it. And so in a way, the urgency of this moment and time, particularly of annexation of land and resource extraction and the militarized state violence in these geographies led me to really thinking about the importance of having a second to articulate some ideas, specifically as I also organize in political movements. And so this article is also not just informed by my readings and analysis and scholarly work, but is also informed by my observations as an organizer that is very much a part of these movements and struggles. So what I think might be helpful is just to begin by outlining some of the key interventions I think I'm trying to make in this article, and then take you through each section briefly before we open it up for sort of a dialogue and conversation. So the article contends, first and foremost, with the theoretical limits of the settler colonial framework, which at times deploys an Indigenous settler binary that privileges narratives of settler triumph and Native failure, erasing the latter's resistance. As well, this binary conflates forms of migration with colonization and doesn't fully contend with race and class differences within settler societies. And also, the framework places less emphasis on how capitalist demands for labor are central to the development of settler capitalist economies, be that in Israel and Palestine, be that in Canada or the US and elsewhere. The article as such argues that the use of the settler colonial analytic alone limits analysis of capitalist violence and specifically, including labor regimes, forced migration, war, race and class resistance, and then as a consequence, solidarity. As such, through a comparative analysis of these settler colonial geographies, Canada and Israel and Palestine, the article seeks to avoid collapsing the specificities of each context in order to contextualize race, class, and gender relations and differences within these settler projects, and also pay attention to capitalist social relations. The article then shifts to compare anti-colonial resistance across these colonies and argues that resistance carried out at specific historical junctures catalyzed economic crises, leading both colonial states to enter negotiations with the colonized as a strategy to maintain settler sovereignty on stolen lands across both these territories. And so I think the analysis sheds light on a praxis of solidarity that has serious implications for organizing, movement building, and joint struggle in the present. So in the first section, Resurgent Solidarity, I described the political and symbolic solidarities that were shaped and expressed between Indigenous people here with the Palestinian struggle, or solidarity activists that are that are pro-Palestinian with the Indigenous struggle here in Canada. from political statements of solidarity to activists putting bodies on the front lines at railway blockades during the shutdown of Canada, or Indigenous activists wearing kufiyas while they defended their territory at Wet'suwet'en, or Native activists attending protests against the Trump plan in Vancouver, or flags, be they Indigenous and Palestinian flags flying side by side at the Tandanega Reservation. I describe these moments, these gestures, events, and expressions of solidarity in a sense in which we see a sort of resurgence of solidarity. And therefore I conceptualize and outline a sort of working definition of what I mean by resurgent solidarity. But I argue that the solidarity is not new, and nor is it the solidarity that has formed in sort of the aftermath or the moment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's recommendations in this contemporary moment that we've been in the last few years in this country. Rather, I suggest that the resurgence of Indigenous Palestine solidarity was recatalyzed, of course, in this political moment, but it is rooted within a much longer history of internationalism and radicalism that has been built over 50 years between struggles, movements, people, and cultural figures. So I then move to the next section, historicizing constellations of resistance and solidarity. This is sort of where I take us back historically before I can, walk us through the sort of contemporary moment we're in, where I discuss how the resurgence of solidarity witnessed in Canada is predated and prefigured by the period of the 1970s, and particularly by the tradition of internationalism, and as Nick outlines in his book, Indigenous internationalism. It was in the 70s when we saw the first significant wave of Indigenous Palestine solidarity, which really developed and crystallized in the era of the Red Power era, as well as during the time of anti-imperialist movements and third world decolonization. And, many revolutionaries were part of building these ties. And in the article, I provide sort of a couple of examples of the Third World People's Coalition, the PLO delegation to Canada that, really was trying to speak to Red Power activists around the Palestinian Revolution and galvanize support for that, as well as the Third World People's Solidarity Coalition. Including also part of that coalition was the Native Study Group and the political stances that study group took in solidarity with Palestine, not just politically to push back the Canadian state's sort of discourse around terrorism to brand the PLO a terrorist group, but also to conduct educationals around an anti-imperialist struggle elsewhere. And so then we see, we see this sort of moment go through a decline at the end of the 80s, but we slowly start to see a resurgence of it in the 90s during the siege of Kanesatake and Kanawake, commonly referred to as the Oka Crisis. And during this period, Palestinian revolutionaries that were affiliated with the PLO participated in the direct actions at Oka. And also when Indigenous revolutionaries examined the Palestinian context, they looked to the First Intifada for alternative models and tactics of resistance and self-reliance as a way to delink from the settler state and a way to imagine different forms of revolutionary activity, specifically in the way in which many of their warriors were being criminalized by the state. And so they started to really look to the Intifada as a model. So as that period ushers out and a new one comes in, a decade after this, in the mid-2000s, a new generation of Palestinian and Palestine solidarity activists developed deeper relationships with Indigenous struggles by making connections between apartheid in Israel and North America, and also become involved in defending struggles for land and land claims, as well as mobilizing campaigns against warriors that are incarcerated by the state. And then more recently, we see sort of a resurgence of solidarity with the Idle No More movement, as well as the Wet'suwet'en struggle, and of course the Trump plan and ongoing annexation that has been taking place in Israel and Palestine, as well as myriads of other issues of oppression and exploitation that are taking place within. So what I just want to highlight around that section is I also really get into critiques of assumptive solidarity and outline the limits of the ways in which, you know, notions of sameness and parallels at times bring people together absolutely to do a very particular kind of work, but the ways in which sometimes that assumption or assumptiveness on shared past or shared resistance can also have its limits. And that section really gets into analyses on some of those limits and pitfalls. Often when people talk about solidarity between these struggles, as I just said, sameness and parallels are often articulated or evoked. However, scholars and activists have cautioned against collapsing the histories across these contexts, but very few engage or have engaged in underlying their distinctions. And so I decided to, you know, discuss some of the key historical, juridical, and political economic distinctions that have consolidated the settler states of Canada and Israel to avoid collapsing the specificities, of course, across these geographic territories, and to contextualize, as I said earlier, race and class differences within these settler projects, and also pay attention to labor regimes. And I also then decided that as I was going to do that, to really kind of show us the distinctions between these geographies and further how they are other limits as well to the settler colonial framework. And so then I take us into this massive theoretical section, which is titled Distinctions in Settler Colonial State Formation, Nuancing the Settler Colonial Analytic. And I really grapple with the debates that have been taking place in settler colonial studies and Indigenous studies for at least the last decade. And in this section, what I'm trying to do is argue that settler colonialism as an analytic concept is generative and helpful, particularly the logic of elimination. However, that it is also limited in the way it diminishes considerations of demand for labor, which certainly was the case in Canada during the fur trade, and also was really a central feature in settler colonies like South Africa, Algeria, Southern Rhodesia, and Kenya. So while settler colonial studies, particularly Patrick Wolf's work, really accentuates colonialism as it rightfully must, though with little emphasis on how capitalist demands for labor are crucial in the development of settler capitalist economies, and particularly how this intersects with the logic of elimination, which I think is very necessary to incorporate when we're specifically also thinking about settler state formation and ongoing settler colonialism, which was and is not possible without capitalism and, you know, the dependence on exploitation, whether that is through slavery, labor regimes, imperialism, genocide, and patriarchy, and of course, racism. The heterogeneity of race anchored in these contexts, the distinction between land and labor, and thus the settler colonial logics of elimination from land and exclusion as exploited labor are not to be thought of as mutually exclusive, but are dialectically connected. And so this is when I start to map out also the distinctions between the settler projects. I move then to get into those distinctions, is that, you know, the major distinction between these two settler territories is treaties. In the context of Canada, you have had a process of treaty formulation or treaty, you know, signing, and regardless of the fact that they have been violated and continue to be violated today, and different acts like the Indian Act have instrumentalized an ongoing elimination of Indigenous peoples in this part of the world, it is still a very distinct kind of history than, shall we say, in Palestine, because in that context, the Zionist project did not sign or go into agreements or treaties with the Indigenous people of that land. Rather, they endured, or they engaged in conquest first through land purchases, coercive measures, and then mass immigration of European Jews to Palestine. And when their Zionist ideological project was failing because they weren't able to conquer the land, they engaged in its ethnic cleansing as Zionist militias attacked Palestinians and drove them out and destroyed their material culture and villages and towns and cities and homes, which is called the Nakba. So there is a distinction there, and I needed to outline that because in the ways in which we talk about the state, that history becomes really important. As well, notions of property were different in the context of this geography. Lockean private property rationales of, sort of individual private property and landholding was sort of the way in which colonists really enacted their project, whereas in the context of Israel, collective land ownership based on the Zionist logic of an ethno-national Jewish-only state created a different way in which the kibbutz and other forms of collective land ownership were at first instituted. Of course, that gets shifted as we enter sort of a neoliberal era, but in terms of the way the initial sort of violence happened, this is central. As well, when we think about race, race was used to manage populations differentially. And in Israel and Palestine, we see that racial purity has been imposed, where in the Canadian context, assimilation was really enforced. And before sort of the onslaught of residential schools and the child welfare system, biological warfare through smallpox and disease spreading and other logics were used to essentially eliminate Indigenous people. So, there is a little bit of a distinction in also how that plays out. Of course, they are similarities, but the way race has been also, how that has managed different populations, how they've been used to differentially manage these populations, Indigenous populations, is something that I think is a little bit distinct. Other distinctions are also around the difference between living under military occupation versus militarized policing or militarized state violence, and citizenship versus being stateless. And again, of course, I don't say this in the article. I really get into the nuances around a politics of refusal and also what citizenship to the state means for Indigenous people and their refusals around that, which, Mohawk scholar Audra Simpson really outlines in her book, Mohawk Interruptus. But in many instances, these distinctions matter because in terms of the refugee population that was exiled in 1948, many of those refugees have been unable to return to their homes and lands. Whereas in the context of Canada, dispossession has happened, absolutely, exile has happened, but many of these Indigenous people from this geography have remained inside. They may have been carved off by the U.S. border, but as a people, there is a distinct difference in terms of the exile and the migration and the forced migration to other places. As well, in some instances, in the Canadian context, Indigenous political traditions and legal systems are still intact, and really, I think the Wet'suwet'en struggle really, taught us that in terms of the, hereditary chiefs and their governance structures, and the ways their laws are actually being used as a way to hold Canada accountable. And again, whether that accountability happens or not is a separate issue, but the fact that there is still this legal mechanism and political traditions that recognize that is still a bit different. In the case of Palestine, this does not exist. So notwithstanding these distinctions, settler colonialism in both contexts, of course, has structured elimination through, legal apparatus, land theft, dispossession, restricted movement, segregation, status, gender and sexual violence, policing, resource extraction, and racialized labor exploitation for settler capitalist accumulation, again, in similar, albeit different ways. Other critiques that I make in the article also include the way in which the settlers triumph in settler colonialist frameworks and versus Indigenous resistance, and sort of that resistance is really underplayed. And so I think one of my interventions is to then also map out the violence and map out the logics, but then also to outline the resistance and what the resistance is against, and what what the resistance is fighting for. And then also I really take up and problematize the settler binary that dominates scholarly work and political organizing, specifically in the context of Canada or North America, I would say. I argue that the settler Indigenous binary has flattened various people's histories and obfuscates the dialectical social relations of colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism on a global scale, where the key historical dynamic has been exploitation, expropriation, dispossession, enclosure, displacement, and involuntary movement across geographies. And binaries such as these that delink from the history of slavery, imperialist occupations and wars, other projects of settler colonialism and capitalist violence, really obscures its global and transnational character and conceals then the violence that immigrant, refugee, including Black communities that might not be descendants of slaves, are subject to, and the multiple violences and dispossessions that they may be forced, that they face, and the ways in which they may be forcefully displaced to settler colonies such as Canada. And I think that when this binary is used, it is dangerous because it not only evacuates refugees and migrants from the system of capitalist imperialism, but it also erases the settler from other people's history. And in this instance, in the context that I work in, Palestinian history. And why that is so important is that I think Nick Estes is, because of his very sort of Marxist orientation and his analysis of imperialism, he is one, him, Roxana Ortiz Dunbar, folks that we're reading in this group that are Indigenous. I think that their texts offer us also different ways of thinking about this. But in the sort of dominant scholarly work in some of the major fields, whether it's in settler colonialism, Indigenous studies, sometimes imperialism is obfuscated. And I think that it does have implications in the way people think about migrants here today and refugees. And that's not to say they don't benefit from being on these stolen lands, but we need to think a bit more carefully about how these debates are actually playing out, especially in political movements and in strategies of resistance. And I think that one of the things that I say is any analysis that deploys this settler colonial frame has to contend also with the emerging class differences within settler societies. Neoliberalism has reinforced class hierarchies and has reconfigured class structures. And in Palestine, this has really taken place in sort of the post-Oslo moment, and you see a different kind of orientation of society, but also you see more and more people turned into, really either temporary foreign workers or temporary laborers in ways that, you didn't see perhaps even before the Oslo era. So I end that section and then move to really talking about, resistance. And I talk about Indigenous Intifada's crisis and political economy and the political economy of peace and reconciliation in the next section, which really pushes against this idea of settler triumph by showing how anti-colonial resistance for decades across these settler colonial geographies has catalyzed economic crises, ushering in negotiations for peace and reconciliation. In that section, I map the economic crises that took place in both of these geographies, essentially from the 70s till the present, and also really speak to the ways in which Indigenous militancy and organized resistance in both geographies particularly mass insurgencies, be it in the first Intifada or after Oslo was passed or during the second Intifada, the kinds of disruptions that, made to the political economy, specifically the Israeli economy. And similarly, how red power militancy and activism in the 60s and 70s, and the widespread resistance to resource extraction and energy sector development, as well as the Oka crisis, also led to this kind of disruption of the economy here in Canada, which really then put these countries in crisis and made them think about different alternatives to come to the table to either recognize Indigenous peoples or try to pacify them in their resistance. And what I show is that in both colonial territories, widespread economic disruption unleashed by direct action, Indigenous militancy, and mass insurgencies produced economic crises and evoked both of these states to then enter into negotiations as a way for them to maintain settler sovereignty and their economies. And in both geographies, this direct action and popular resistance really destabilized the expropriation of resources and the economic infrastructure, which is at the core, that is core to the accumulation of capital in these settler economies. And so again, this leads them to, wanting peace with the Palestinians, and it leads us to truth and reconciliation. Again, these moves undermine aspirations for self-determination, liberation, and decolonization. And as Glenn Coulthard's work has also showed us around the politics of recognition and critiques on that, is that people have bought into that politics, including Indigenous people, including capitalists or people that have bought into capitalism that are from these Indigenous communities. This is certainly the case in Palestine. The Palestinian Authority also adheres to this ideology, and so in many ways these moves have really undermined the liberation struggle, and also has really hampered solidarity in a way that we saw in the 70s when, Indigenous internationalism or other forms of internationalism really worked to resist imperialist and colonial power and forces. So I finally conclude with emphasizing the importance then of solidarity, particularly radical solidarity, and its urgency as capitalist violence is intensifying. It is not only killing people, oppressing and exploiting human beings, and in the context of the paper that I'm writing, Indigenous people, but it's also killing the planet. And therefore, we need, as I say at the end of the paper, we need to really think of different ways to world make outside of these structures. So I want to end there, as that's, I think, a really deep summary of that paper. And I'm really looking forward to just having a dialogue at this point. So thank you for listening.